Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Chad Toprak, and I'm the Artistic Director of Freeplay. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Freeplay hosts and broadcasts from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, where stories have been shared and games have been played since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and to anyone watching who has a connection to the world's oldest living culture. Sovereignty was never ceded, and the violence of the colonial project is still ongoing. So welcome to this very exciting and personal session. Session is titled Pieces of Me, Making Personal Games. And joining us is Mel Taylor. Mel is a narrative game designer and director of Mellow Games, currently working on the narrative platformer Blueberry. Most recently, Mel worked on the narrative design and writing for survival adventure Windbound by Five Live Studio in Brisbane. In 2014, she co-founded the German game studio Osmotic Studios and co-created Orwell, an award-winning data privacy thriller. She also worked as a lecturer in game design and game art. Please make Mel welcome, and I will now pass it over to you, Mel.
Thank you. Chad basically did all of the introduction already, so I guess I don't have to introduce myself again. But as you can see, I decided to make this talk because it is a very personal topic, a bit more of a personal talk as well. So welcome to my couch. Please join me here and listen to my story. So it's not going to be a sort of classic PowerPoint presentation, digital slides kind of thing, and maybe not clear takeaways or anything, but I'm just going to talk about how I started making this game and how I put some of my personal stories into it. And I actually, first of all, I have to state a content warning. So I'm going to touch on things such as suicide and depression and self-harm. So if those are things that you don't want to hear about, please turn it off now. But otherwise, I'm going to sort of structure this talk into sort of talking about the game Blueberry on the one hand, and myself, me and my personal life, I guess, on the other hand. And I just thought, since I don't have slides or anything, Mr. Android is going to show us which side of the talk we are on. So that means this side is I'm talking about the game, and this side is I'm talking about myself. And yeah, so let's dive into it. So, first of all, Blueberry is a story about a woman's mind from birth to death. So it plays basically inside her mind, and the player climbs this tower called the Tower of Life. And you climb it from bottom to top, getting older as you climb upward. The game is divided into 4 life phases. That means at the beginning you're a child, then you're a teenager, then you're an adult, and then you're an elderly lady. And on your way up, you encounter doors that lead to her memories. And the game is comprised of basically platforming on the one hand and these mini games on the other hand. So the platforming part is mostly the tower, sort of jumping through this tower and climbing it. And then the mini games are things like when you're a child, you steal cookies from your mom's kitchen, or when you're older, you go to a party when you're a teenager and there's dialogue, but there's also like just small sort of physical puzzles, if you like. So yeah, at some point, the player is going to be able to go back down the tower. So that means you can revisit memories, which we sort of present in a sepia color palette, kind of like an old photo. And you can go back to the mini games that you already played, but they will play out differently, or new areas will be unraveled. And so as Blueberry revisits her memories, they change depending on how her perspective changes. And that's why the minigame changes. And you will also be able to find missing memories in this area of the tower, which sort of touches on the topic of trauma and how these memories were repressed by her. Since I don't have slides or anything to show you the game, I'm just going to show you something else that a very dear friend of mine made. So, sorry, I'm a bit shaky because I always shake. But this was made by a friend of mine called Frizzle. And it's basically the child character from the game. So thank you so much for that. It's a wonderful present. But so let's dive into it. I first had the idea about Blueberry about in 2017. And my first thought about it was, what if I make a game about someone who stays in bed and never sort of starts the day? And it was much later that I found out this is sort of one of the first symptoms of depression. And it might sort of sound nice and relaxing. I can stay in bed, I don't have to start my day, but that's not really what it is like for someone who's depressed. So usually it just means saying no to life. It means I've given up and I don't want to start my day. I don't want to live my life. And because it's meaningless. And this thought occurred to me much later, but this first idea was kind of started around this. But it was inspired by a book I had read maybe 10 years ago when I was studying graphic design by Alex Garland called The Coma. And it was about this guy who got beaten up in a subway and then he fell into a coma. And the rest of the book is basically about how he tries to wake up from this coma. And I even made an illustrated book because I love this book so much. So this is sort of my version of it. It's in German, the title, sorry. And it was based on the idea that the whole thing is sort of a dream. And there are, if you know, in dreams, you often can't see things properly. There are these really dark areas in the dream on the one hand, but there's also this very blurry, overly white area of the dream on the other hand. So it's based on this sort of black and white drawings that I made for it. And yeah, what I found really interesting about this book was that it asks questions about identity. So that means the narrative revelation of the book was who is this person? Because as soon as he fell into a coma, he forgot who he is, and his goal was to find out who he is. So he visits different memories from his childhood or whatever parts of his life to find out who he is. And at some point, he is like, I feel like I'm losing my mind. And how do I know what is me? And like, if I lost a toe or an arm, no one would argue that this is not still me. But if I lost my mind, am I still me? So I thought these were really interesting questions. And I wanted to explore what makes a person and what makes identity and how do memories work. And that's how I started working on Blueberry. And the first structural idea I had about that game was to make a kind of a cube. So the mini games were something that were in the game from the start. These memories that I wanted the player to be able to play. But at the beginning, I didn't have an idea about the platforming part. So this was the basic structure of the game and the way that the player would find the mini games. And this cube that I thought of at the beginning would have like an X, Y, and Z axis, and the player would just be able to go from minigame to minigame on any of these axes. And it was kind of like a multiverse cube where you could go through these memories, and depending on which path you choose, the story would change. But obviously, anyone who has ever made a game would immediately probably think this is much too much scope, because let's say you only have 10 pieces of the cube, it would already be so many different possibilities that you could explore, that it would just be a lot that the player would never see. So my next thought was, okay, let's get rid of one axis, basically the y-axis, and it would be a flat board. So this is a drawing of these beginnings of that. I hope it's not too shaky. So basically, you would be able to go through this board and choose a path and would get one of these icons for each memory that you play. But I did get rid of that idea as well because it was still a lot. And it was still a majority of the game that the player would potentially never see if they wouldn't bother to replay it. So in the end, I settled on the tower idea, sort of just pretty linearly going from bottom to top and going through these memories. But the non-linear part, if you like, would be the story, because you would not encounter these memories in a chronological order, but instead you would be able to go back into the past and learn more about the memories that you had already played. A bit like time travel, I guess. So now I'm going to talk a bit more about me and what I was doing when I had this first idea. So as mentioned, I had founded my first studio in Germany called Osmotic Studios, and I had made a game called Orwell, and we had released that in October 2016. And it was pretty successful for us as a small team. And we were super excited and super happy about the positive reception. And we just started working on a follow-up for Orwell called Ignorance is Strength. And this was focused a bit more on media manipulation and fake news, whereas the first part was about data surveillance. And I really loved working on this very political and very timely game and be able to work on something that was also social commentary on something that happened in the world right now, especially in the Trump era. And but I also knew that I wanted to make something more intimate and personal after that. So I decided to leave the team and I wanted to start my own games company and work on my own stuff. At the same time, the idea came up to move to Australia. So at that time, I was living with my then partner, and it was actually his idea. And part of my family is English, and I always thought I would move to England, but never did. And I always wanted to move to an English-speaking country. So I really liked the idea of moving to Australia. And so that is when we started planning on doing that. So now back to Blueberry. I started prototyping the game, and this was after basically I had already finished working on Ignorance is Strength. We had just released that game, and I was sort of in the process of leaving my team. And I had worked on the basic idea and concept, and now I wanted to start working on a new game. So I started prototyping, and I am not a programmer. My background is in graphic design and specialty in narrative design. So I didn't know how to program, but I watched a lot of Unity tutorials and I started learning C#, and it was very exciting. And I really loved making little scenes for the game. But it was also very primitive, and I knew that I quickly just didn't know how to progress. So everything I did for a programmer, it would have taken 5 minutes, and for me, it took hours, of course. And I did a lot of turning game objects on and off, but it was very fun and empowering to do the programming part myself for a while, even if it was not very good. So yeah, that's when I started prototyping. At the same time, this was around 2018. So I moved here in June 2018, which is nearly exactly 3 years ago now. And it was a big decision, of course. So Germany is about 16,000 kilometers away, and the flight is very long and very expensive. And it was, despite me being very into the idea of living in Australia, it was hard to say goodbye to everyone, especially my sisters, who are the most important people to me in the world. And I remember I was crying a lot when I said goodbye to them, and it was difficult, but I also felt like I'm starting a new life and I'm looking forward to it. And yeah, it was an exciting time. But pretty much one day after we landed in Melbourne, unfortunately, it sort of started, my partner started telling me that he was not so happy with the relationship and he didn't want to live in Melbourne. And that was a bit weird because I think it was especially because of the weather, and Melbourne is very cold, and especially winter, and it was the middle of winter. And I suppose a lot of Europeans think that it's super warm and sunny everywhere in Australia, but that's just not the case. And we had been in Brisbane before together when we had traveled a few years ago, and we both really liked it. So he wanted to move to Brisbane. And I didn't really want that because I thought that the main games industry in Australia is in Melbourne, and it's really thriving and it's really interesting, and I wanted to stay there and explore that. And I didn't know anything about the games industry in Brisbane. So that was a bit difficult at the beginning. And yeah, that was what I was doing at the time. It was a really interesting time, prototyping in an Airbnb. I'm working on the game. Oh, sorry. We're talking about Blueberry now again. Mr. Android was on the wrong side, unfortunately. But yeah, the next thing I did was write the narrative design document for Blueberry. And the way I usually write is I sort of outline the structure at the beginning, and then I just write in a way that sort of stream of consciousness, and just write everything that I have in my mind about the game, no matter how chaotic or stupid it sounds, just to get it out. And then I go through everything and edit and improve and structure everything. And that is basically what I was doing then after having made some prototypes. Yeah, and this was also the time when I had the idea of using a tower as the basic structure. So I thought that a tower would be a good symbol for going through life, basically, because you climb from bottom to top, and it's sort of, well, it's kind of always a bit difficult and challenging maybe, but it can also be a fun adventure. So it's both of those things that make up the tower in Blueberry. And that is also the time when I thought of the narrative goal of the game. So I wanted something for the player to be able to explore and find out narrative-wise. And the central narrative goal is finding out what happened in Blueberry's life and what her trauma is. And the environment and the story talks to the player throughout the game and gives hints about this. And it finally sort of concludes by finding this one particular memory where this traumatic event happened. Now I'm going to talk about me again. So I moved to Brisbane with my partner, and 6 months later we broke up. So it didn't work out, and it was a very, very difficult time for me because it had obviously been a big decision to move to Australia with him. And I thought I would sort of start the rest of my life with him. And it was a very difficult decision to break up. And obviously, anyone who has ever gone through a breakup knows how difficult that is, especially if it's someone you wanted to spend the rest of your life with. and we had been together for about 5 years. And yeah, it was for me a very difficult time of heartbreak. And I started reading a lot of self-help books during that time. And it actually helped me a lot. I think I just wanted to make sense of what had happened. And it was just very devastating for me. And I wanted some sort of way to find out why it had happened, I think, and how I could cope with it. And the other thing was that I didn't know many people here, obviously. And so I didn't have anyone around me who knew me well, who I could talk about these things with. And so it was also very isolating, being this far away from anyone I knew well in my life, and then going through something that is so devastating. And I also started to realize and also read about how these difficult events in your life can re-traumatize you if you already had traumatizing experiences in the past. And yeah, this is kind of what happened to me at that time. So going back to Blueberry and Mellow Games, actually. So I started my new studio called Mellow Games, and I started working at SQ Hub, which is basically the office space sponsored by Screen Queensland, which is a great space for game developers and film producers and other screen practitioners. And I was very, very thankful and happy that I was able to get a desk there, because it meant I didn't have to stay at home alone all the time. And I also wanted to, at this point, thank Caitlin Boucher, who ran SQ Hub until a while ago, and she really helped me at that time. And it was just so comforting to be able to go to a place every day and have a kind of normal life and a normal workspace with other people who are also working on their own games. So that helped me a lot, but it also helped me with prototyping. So one of my good friends, David, who also does the programming on Blueberry now, he helped me a lot with the prototype, and he always helped me with my programming problems. And I was very thankful for that. And it really helped progress the game. So I started Mellow Games. I started working on a logo, a website, and business cards, all of that stuff. Started making a real game studio, and it felt like I was kind of getting my life back together and starting to create an environment for myself that felt more like I'm a normal person who has normal work. I also started recruiting a team. So we're currently 4 people, including myself. And so we're a programmer, an audio designer, a 2D animator, and me. And we created a more viable prototype at the time that we applied for the Screen Queensland grant with. So this is the Screen Queensland Games Finance grant, and we were able to get that for the game. And that was also something that really helped progressing and really helped like actually realizing the game at the time. So this was in 2019. And a lot of people ask me, why didn't you just move back to Germany at that time? And I think for me, it was, on the one hand, like moving back wouldn't mean that everything would be the same. It would never be the same. And I didn't really see any point in that. But also, I just didn't want anything in my personal life to change at that time. I just wanted everything to stay the same for now, because it had been so much change and so much new stuff, and it was just overwhelming after moving on the other side of the world getting to know so many new people, having to go through like the whole moving stuff. That's a logistical problem of itself. And then finding a place to live, breaking up with someone I had been with for so long, then finding a new place to live. Anyway, it was all very, very stressful, and I just wanted nothing to change at the moment, and to be able to sort my thoughts, I guess. So I decided to stay in Brisbane. But I also kind of came to terms with the fact that I would never have children. And this was actually something that was a big reason why my relationship didn't work out, because my partner really wanted kids and I didn't really trust the relationship enough to be able to say yes to that. So yeah, that was something that was on my mind at the time that also influenced the game a lot. And talking about the game again, I had the idea of using Blueberry's memories as these mini games that you could go through and exploring how memories change. So at that time, I read a lot about how the human mind works and about how memories work, and about how memories are not like files that you just access and then they always stay the same, but they change basically whenever you think of them. And as you age and your perspective changes, the memories can also basically change, or at least the context of the way you see those memories. And I read this book called The Body Keeps the Score. There's this one. I think this was probably from all the books I read, the most influential for the game. And it's by a Belgian psychotherapist or psychiatrist called Bessel van der Kolk. And he is kind of an expert on trauma. And the whole sort of premise of the book is that trauma doesn't only affect the mind, but also the body. And that this is something that is often neglected by modern psychotherapy. But it was also very interesting to read about how he sort of did research on the way he treated patients. So I had always thought that the only way you can treat stuff like that is through talking therapy. And in a way, he did similar things. But one thing that he did was, it was kind of a group therapy, and the person who is going through the therapy session can sort of assign roles to the other group therapy members and recreate basically traumatizing events from their life in a safe environment. And also talk about how they felt in that moment and what they would have wanted to happen, how they would have wanted to change those memories. And this fascinated me because it is kind of like going back in time and changing something that you thought you could never change. And I was just very fascinated by this neuroplasticity of the mind, and how you can reframe things after they have already happened, even though you can never change the past. And yeah, I really wanted to put this into a game mechanic. Now, talking about myself again. So as you may have guessed, I also didn't really have a very easy past. So in my childhood, there was a lot of neglect and pressure and self-harm, suicide attempts from my family members, but also from myself. So I really know what it's like to be so devastated and feel so alone that you don't want to live anymore. But I also know what it's like to have a strong fear of people that you love going through that as well. And so I think this gave me a kind of a different perspective on these things, because as much as I knew how horrible it is, I also knew how horrible it is to witness how someone is going through a suicide attempt or to strong depression, and many visits of psychiatric clinics, and that was basically my childhood. So yeah, that was very difficult. And as much as I didn't really want to make a game about myself and about my story, and this game is not about me, but I started kind of realizing that these parts of me are in the game, and that this is the reason why I want to explore this. Okay, going back to the game. So Blueberry also has a mechanic that I call the blues mechanic. So it's basically a UI element which measures Blueberry's depression. And it's this bar that goes from 0 to 100%. And the goal for the player is to keep it down. And I sometimes call it an inverted health bar. But it also sort of determines the story state. So that means if in a mini game scene, the bar goes to 100%, then often the scene would stop. And it's basically like a story fail state, because it's not like you replay the scene because you have died, but the story changes, and it's kind of like, okay, either you reach story state A or story state B. And at the same time, the higher this blues bar goes, the more blue the world turns. So we're working with we call it the blues shader in the game, and this doesn't have a mechanical outcome really, but it sort of makes the game look more depressing, I guess. And also the player can influence this blues bar by picking up items, for example, food, in order to feel a little bit better, make Blueberry feel a little bit better, but also negative events, like, for example, when someone said something very mean to her, can also influence it and make it go up. And at a later point in the game, we have these word fights where, for example, she has a fight with her mom, and each person has a blues bar, and the person whose blues bar gets to 100% loses the fight and storms out. So that's kind of like this whole thing, like if you've ever had a fight with someone, a word fight, then it's not really about what you're talking about, but it's about, yeah, I want to win. I want to hurt this person more than they hurt me. And that's sort of the family dynamics we're talking about in the game. And the hook of the game was also something that became clearer at that point. So the hook is basically Blueberry, as an adult, has her own child. And at this point, she decides that she wants to work through her trauma and get better for the sake of her child, because she now feels like she has a reason to do this. And so I made a sort of intro scene where she is talking to her son, and then she says something like, I want to be a good mom for you, and that's why I have to work through this, and I have to face my trauma. Now we're coming to 2020, our favorite year, everyone's favorite year, when the pandemic started. And of course, this was a time that wasn't easy for anyone. And for me personally, it was also a very lonely time, because, yeah, as I said, I didn't know many people here and no one knew me very well. So it was difficult to talk about personal stuff with anyone. And I I spent a lot of time alone in my apartment. And that's something where, yeah, you can just spend every day, all day, thinking about how sad you are and feeling sorry for yourself. And that's what I did. And I didn't really have much help. At that time, I started taking antidepressants and started psychotherapy again, but it didn't really help me. But what helped me was reading my self-help books and trying to understand the science of how the mind works and how trauma works, and at the same time, I guess working on Blueberry in that sense helped me as well. But I also realized that I didn't want to go into old patterns anymore. I didn't want to sort of go down the road of not taking care of myself, of being self-destructive. I wanted to get better and take responsibility for myself. And I think that is also something that is very present in the game. Like this thought of, I don't want to do this anymore, and I want to get better and process these things. So yeah, it's kind of getting more and more intertwined now, the stuff about me and the stuff about Blueberry, I guess. But yeah, so basically I now say Blueberry is not me, but the game is my story. So I can't really help having something of me in the game, and maybe that's not a bad thing, because I think I always thought it was so self-indulgent and so weird to just make a game about yourself, and that's not what I want to do. I think I want to show people on the one hand that trauma and depression is something very nuanced and what it's like to go through that, but I also want to show people who are going through these things that they're not alone. Another thing in the game is that a reoccurring thing is water as an obstacle or something that potentially kills the player character, like you drown sometimes in the game. And a lot of people who speak about depression speak about the experience of being in water and sort of having like a transparent wall between yourself and everything that you experience. Everything feels sort of numb and far away from you. And so water is something that occurs often in Blueberry as a symbol for depression as well. But we also have this antagonist in the game, which is like a little purple monster that that Blueberry encounters often in the game, and that is kind of a mischievous villain who puts obstacles in her way or steals stuff that she needs. But it's also it has a diving suit on, and it's kind of this thought of this monster is safe from this depression. It has this armor that keeps it safe. And it's not a scary monster. It actually looks kind of cute, but it's sort of the villain of the story, without spoiling anything. Yep. So I think it was also important for me that if this game does work out, if I don't manage to finish it, then I'm going to be okay. And this game is not me, and I shouldn't put too much of myself into the game. But also I wanted it to be sincere and comforting and made from the heart. So those are the two things I'm still sort of working with. And so talking about the game again, we're currently sort of hitting a wall with the game. So basically the game is financed by the Screen Queensland grant on the one hand, but also my revenue that I got from my previous game, Orwell. And unfortunately, we're running out of money now. And as much as the Screen Queensland grant helped us, it's unfortunately not enough, by far not enough to make a complete game, even if it's a small game. And so I have been pitching to publishers, and so far no luck, but I'm going to continue and not give up on the game yet. I still hope that we can finish it. But yeah, that's sort of the status right now for Blueberry. And for me, it's important for me to show the player, I guess, that that you should never stop climbing the Tower of Life, and to not give up. But also show that this is not easy. It's really, really hard work. And it's not like in the movies where you sort of have this one point of your life and then suddenly you get over everything and everything, the rest of your life will be great. But I feel like it's more sort of, for me personally, like a diet of the mind, and really having to work every single day on changing patterns and getting better, and um, being strong and hopeful. And that's very, very hard. And I wanted to show this in the game as well. Um, so yeah, in the end, it was kind of in the middle now. I want Blueberry to give players hope, but also nuance about what it's like to be depressed and what it's like to be traumatized. So I looked a bit at some statistics for this, and I read that there are about 9 suicides per day in Australia and over 65,000 attempts each year. So that's obviously horrible, and but it also shows kind of that if you're going through stuff like this, you're not alone. And I think that was important for me also. That in a way my experience is not unique, and I'm not like abnormal and not far away from society or anything. But one thing I think about my experience is unique, and that is that I have 3 sisters who I went through with all of these things, that grew up with me and who know me better than no one else. And 2 of them are going to be moms now soon as well. And although I know, I'm pretty sure I won't have kids in my life, I'm going to go through this with them. And it's just so special and lovely to be able to do that. And I think, yeah, so that's sort of why motherhood is a big theme in Blueberry, and why this is so important for me. Yeah, that was my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. It was interesting to talk about these things in a talk, but I really loved the opportunity that I got from Free Play to do this, and I really appreciate it. And yeah, if you have questions, please ask now. I'm going to get my laptop a bit closer to my couch so that I can actually answer questions. Okay. Okay, so do you find it challenging to translate your personal feelings or experiences into gameplay? Definitely. So I think one of the reasons why it was important to me to frame it as though I wasn't talking about myself is that it's hard to have this distance from the experience to translate it into gameplay. So, because gameplay will always be abstract and will always sort of be not quite what it feels like. But on the other hand, I don't want players to feel bad either. I want players to feel like empathy towards the characters. And I don't want to just make the player go through the same thing that I went through. And yeah, that it is very difficult. And obviously, it needs a lot of sort of testing and feedback from players and what they think about it, because I'm not making this just for myself. But yeah, it's also because I'm so close to this experience, I think that it's also important for me to do it right. So that's a plus, I guess. Another question. When thinking about these suicide stats, do you also think about how it changes for each demographic? Also, I love your onesie. Thank you. That's my professional pajama. So yes, that's a big deal. So these suicide statistics actually say that 75% of suicides are um, done by men. So often men are sort of, I guess, more closed down uh, about things like that. And that's why I guess the statistics are higher for them. But there's also indigenous people. The suicide rates, I think they were saying they're maybe double or 3 times as high for indigenous people in Australia. And also people from the LGBTQ community. Um, it's like so much more difficult. And but yeah, in the same way, so Blueberry does tell the story about someone who comes from a quite poor family that is sort of economically disadvantaged, because that is what I have most experience with. But these other things are things that I don't really have my own experiences with. So the game doesn't really touch on that so much. But yeah, I'm hoping that it'll be something that people from every demographic will be able to relate to. When a game's story is based on your own life, how do you make it more mainstream approachable? Or do you just let it be as weird as life is? Um, well, I don't know how mainstream my life is, but I think that some experiences are just things that we all sort of go through. And yeah, it's sort of, I actually think that these are things that everyone can relate to, because it's basically sort of overcoming obstacles and coming to terms with who you are and how you want to live your life. And that is something I think that everyone can relate to. But also, on the other hand, maybe it doesn't have to be that mainstream. Maybe it can just be for people who think about being a mom or maybe even being a dad, I hope. And yeah, like you don't always have to make games for everyone, I think. So there's that as well. Do you think putting some distance and time to process your personal experiences makes for better and perhaps more responsible, intimate work, as in avoiding to use making art as a substitute for therapy? Um, I think for me it helps to put some distance into that. But this is a very personal thing. So I don't think this is the same for everyone. And I also think that art can be therapeutic, but you have to be careful, because if you put your own personal stuff into everything you make, and if this thing gets criticized or if it doesn't work out, then you will think that people are talking about you and not your thing. So I think it's also, for me personally, a way to protect myself from that. Although I'm kind of, I'm doing that now. I'm sort of connecting this whole thing to me. So there's that as well. And I think that helps me too. But yeah, you have to be careful. It is a very tricky line to walk, I think. Also, as someone who moved from Switzerland to Australia around the same time you did, going through the whole visa experience is hard, and I'm glad we made it through. Lol. Yeah, it is so hard. It is really, really hard. Yeah, I'm glad you also made it through. It's so difficult. Another question: what advice would you give to devs hoping to explore their experiences with health, mental health through their games practice? Uh, so what advice would you give devs to explore their experiences about mental health, I guess? Yeah, I think I would say something similar to the last answer. Try to separate it. I would always try to do that. As much as art can be therapeutic, don't think that your art is you, and maybe try to use that as an outlet on the one hand, but try to make something that is not only about you. And maybe try to get some distance from the experience. Like, I think it's great, and it's fine to sort of write your experiences down as they happen, or try to make art during that experience, but maybe it's enough if that's only for you. And if you want to actually make something that you want to publish and that's commercial, then maybe just get some distance from it, like a few months or weeks or however long it takes before you actually do that, or maybe even years, because it's dangerous to put too much of yourself into a commercial product that players are going to criticize harshly and also maybe not receive in the way that you think they will. Like, you have to be fine with that. Hope that answers the question. Okay, that's all questions we have. Yeah, I guess I can give back the microphone to Chad then. Thank you very much for listening. And yeah, if you have any further questions or anything, you can hit me up on Twitter. My handle is Mel__T. And you can also playtest Blueberry on Steam right now. So just put in Blueberry on Steam, and I would love your feedback.